coming. I wish it were cooler. I wish it were better lighted. I wish the carpet didn't look like a barn. But then again, this is a public institution, and we're lucky we have any lights at all. And probably within a couple months, we won't. And then we'll meet in the dark. That would be symbolically appropriate given what I'm about to say. Anyway, this is the greatest crisis of capitalism in my lifetime. And given the way you all look and given my white hair, that means it's the greatest crisis of capitalism in your lifetime too. And it therefore requires an extraordinary effort to understand it and an even more extraordinary effort to come up with a program to deal with it. What I'm going to do is try to explain to you how I see this crisis and how it arose, where it comes from, and then to offer a socialist response to it. And this is not because of my abstract interest. I am one. That's why I'm interested in doing this. I want to develop a socialist response to it. I just don't want to do it in the realm of theory. I want to do it in actuality. And the best way I know how to do that is to use the most highly developed theory for doing such things, which is Marxist theory. So that's what you're going to get, a Marxist analysis of what happened and what might be done. So let me begin, as is necessary in these sorts of things, by saying what I think this crisis is not. It is not, for example, a financial crisis. It strikes me as outrageous, as an attempt to limit the scope, the causes, and the implications of this thing as if it were only one sector, finance. That strikes me as the equivalent of thinking that a serious pain somewhere in your body should not be investigated as to whether or not it has something to do with the system of your bodily functions that happens to show up here or there. It's an attempt to make the symptom where it blows up be the localized place beyond which it hasn't spread. You might hope it hasn't spread, but simply asserting it and assuming it could be deadly. And I think it's deadly in this case. I also don't think this has much to do with executive pay, which has been outrageous for at least 25 years in this country. It doesn't have to do with greed. You probably have figured out already that greed predates this crisis. Consequently, these are efforts in my mind to keep us away from the central issue, which is to raise the question, is this a crisis of the system as a whole, rather than a problem with this or that aspect of the crisis? The media are virtually at one in keeping it limited. That's, after all, the job of the media in our culture, to calm us, to relax us, to give us human interest stories instead of the news. And so I don't want to do that. And so I want it to be understood that my approach is to say this is a crisis that affects all the parts of this system, manufacturing, services, finance, to be sure, included, but in no way restricted. It didn't start with finance. It's not ending with finance. I want to put it back in the context from which I think it was ripped. In order to do that, and always because I'm conscious, being an economics professor, that I have colleagues in the room, or even if they're not in the room, they'll hear about it, it's always necessary for us to do something on the board to demonstrate kind of our bona fides, that we can do things on the board. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to tell the story, as best I can, of how we got into this mess here in the United States. And I'm going to divide this little graph into two parts. One part goes from 1820 to around 1970, 150 years, during which the productivity of American workers went up each year. The line goes up simply to say that the average worker produced more stuff every year than they did the year before. They were trained better, they had better machines, they had more machines, so the productivity per worker went up every year. Okay. For this period of time, I'm going to draw a second line. And that second line represents what happened to workers' wages in the United States. It's really remarkable that the wages of American workers rose from 1820 to the 1970s. Every decade, they were higher than the decade before. Real wages. Real wages means the amount of money you get as against the prices you have to pay for the things you use your money for. And the profits went something like that. In other words, productivity went up, and in the sense of economics, the workers shared that productivity rise by rising wages, and the corporations enjoyed rising profits. Okay? And that's very peculiar. There may not be any other capitalist country that had 150 years of that experience. It certainly gave the American working class the idea, and you'll see the relevance of this in a couple minutes, gave the working class the idea that the United States was really special. Here's a place where year after year you do better. Your children will do better than you did, and your grandchildren will do still better, and there's something awfully special. Some people called it the exceptional America. And, you know, being Americans, the major explanation for this required looking up. He likes us better than he likes other people, something that's been reaffirmed, as you know, many times. George Bush said it too. Sarah Palin said it the other night, so it's well known. There are other arguments given. You know, we have virgin land, untouched land, as long as you forget the people who were touching it before, things like that. Nonetheless, there is this hard, powerful reality that the American working class enjoyed 150 years of rising consumption. It's therefore not surprising that a working class that enjoys rising consumption for 150 years would choose to define its own self-worth, measure its own success in life according to the standard of consumption. That's safe. That's going up. Safe thing to measure yourself in. So Americans began to think of themselves as successful if they lived in the right neighborhood, drove the right car, wore the right outfit, had the right vacation in the right part of Europe, etc. Americans became wedded to consumption in a way that other working classes in the world hadn't, probably still haven't. It's not an accident that in the United States, the industry we call advertising rose first and developed further than anywhere else. A whole industry devoted to cultivating the passion for consumption in a population already 3/4 of the way there. Why is this important? It's important because in 1970, the world changed for the American working class in ways I don't think it has come to terms with at all. Here's what happened. The middle line, the real wages, stopped going up. They go like this, sort of, bending down a little bit. The real weekly wage, the real hourly wage of a worker in the late 1970s was higher than it is today. What you get for an hour of work in the way of goods and services is less now than your parents got before. Real wages stopped. Productivity kept going up. And if you understand what will happen, it doesn't take any kind of advanced degree. I'm not against you getting an advanced degree. It takes a long time, and these days it won't do much beyond taking a long time, but you don't need it. You don't need it. If what you get from each worker keeps going up, but what you give each worker doesn't, then the difference between what each worker produces and what you pay him or her gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This difference here gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The difference between what you get from each worker and what you pay him becomes unbelievable. The last 30 years, roughly since 1970-75, has been an unbelievable time in America. And it begins with the leveling out of wages. A 150-year history is over. And the American people are beginning slowly to sense that the consumption joy is finished. Let's look at why that happened. In the 1970s, a number of factors came together to make that possible. First, the recovery of the defeated World War II competitors, Europe, Japan, meant that American businesses faced competition. And competition from people who had developed their economies after the war with the idea that the only way to succeed was to beat the Americans who dominated everything from 1945 to 75. So if you're going to make it, you have to produce what America produces better or cheaper or best of all, both. And so we all drive Japanese cars. Summary, right? Or if we don't do that, we drive European cars. Perfect example, though that was a major industry in the United States, automobiles, and they went to work to replace us, and they've succeeded. So Americans' businesses reacted in part by leaving the United States, looking to find cheap places of producing somewhere else. That meant Americans lost their job, and so they began to work for less money. The wages start going down. Second, if American companies